Hey there boys and girls, my name's Kyle, better known on the YouTubes as Blendcraft, and welcome to a beginner's guide to game development. In today's episode, we'll be covering the basics of exporting models from Blender into Unity. Now I'll be using Unity 2018.2, but the version for this doesn't matter because the principles that we'll be covering have existed since pretty much the beginning of Unity. Speaking of which, the required resources for this episode will be Blender, which you can get at blender.org, and Unity, which you can get at unity3d.com. So to kick off this tutorial, we're going to start in Blender. If you don't already have a basic cube, just go ahead and add one. You can hit space, type in cube, hit enter, you're good to go. Now we're not going to do any crazy modeling or anything fancy because this isn't a modeling tutorial, it's just showing you a workflow and a streamlined process. So all we're going to do is go up to File, go to Export, and we're going to export a .fbx. I'll call mine cube.fbx. Now the reason for the .fbx is because this is what the industry considers their standard, and we'll talk a little bit why that is later. As for the settings of the FBX, the defaults are all fine, but you can feel free to uncheck any of the unnecessary options if you desire. Now I'm going to switch over to Unity. I already have a project created and opened, so I'm ready to import. I'm going to go to the Assets folder, right click, click Import, and then find my cube.fbx file. Mine's my desktop. An alternate way that you can import files is to actually open up your projects folder and then drag in the file manually. Then when you tab or switch back into Unity, it'll auto-magically re-import or import for you. Now our model looks fine and you'd think we're ready to go, but we're not. If you drag that bad boy into the hierarchy and then select them, you'll see that some things are pretty screwy. The scale is usually like 100 by 100 by 100, and like there's always like a weird rotation of like off by 90 degrees, or it's like negative 90 degrees. And this is a Blender thing. It always does this whenever you're importing from Blender. I don't know if it's just their units are way off, and I don't know if you can actually go into Blender and change your unit scale sizing to fix this. And I've tried exporting, changing the actual considered Z axis to every single axis, and it just doesn't matter. It's always going to import with that negative degrees. So I'm going to show you a quick and easy fix of how to get rid of this annoying craziness that Blender sticks us with. So all we're going to do is go to our hierarchy, right click, and create a new empty object. Now with this empty object, we're going to create a parent-child hierarchy structure within our hierarchy. You grab your cube and you drag it onto the empty cube object, making it the parent to your cube. I'm going to select my new parent object and rename it as the cube. I'm going to drag it down to my assets to make it a prefab, so that means we can instantiate it or do whatever we want with it later. Now the reason for this is because if you click on the parent empty object and you look at its transform settings, everything is where it should be. All the position and rotations are at 0 and the scale's at 1. And the reason why we want to do this is because we don't want anything to be really screwy when we start working with our models within Unity. We want everything to be default, standard, normal. If you need an example of why you don't want this, let's say you're going to go into a script and actually modify the Euler angles. So if we want to rotate our cube, we can rotate it with a script, but then let's say we want to set it back to its default rotation. You have to remember that its default rotation is that weird negative 90 point whatever, negative 89 point whatever, and you have to remember this crazy weird number. But it'd be so much easier if the default was just 0. And so that's why we create an empty parent object. It's so that we can actually modify our transforms for our model without having to remember any crazy numbers or having to worry about anything weird going on. Now you could argue that you can go into your model within the file browser, and then for the import settings, you could adjust the scale. If it's off by 100, maybe multiply it by 0.01, and then you could scale it all the way down to 1. But why mess with weird things and you have to remember what you did when you can just create an empty object and then just scale that object and you don't have to worry about anything else? Personally, I think this is one of the easiest workflows for bringing objects into Unity from Blender, and you just don't have to worry about any of the mess. Now for some additional tips and tricks. Let's say you wanted to update your model. So in Blender, I'm going to hit E to extrude, I to extrude and scale down the face, and I'm going to hit E to extrude again. Now with my modified model, I'm going to go to File, Export, and then export the FBX and call it the same thing. Now I'm going to open my file structure, I'm going to drop in my .fbx into the folder, and then confirm the overwrite of the old file. Now when I switch back into Unity, it should auto-magically re-import for me, but if it doesn't, I can just click on my file, right click, and select re-import. Now if we look at the scene editor, you can see that my model is updated. Now if you don't like this workflow of having to export and re-import and overwrite and do all this stuff, there is a more integrated workflow that we can create because Unity actually works really well with Blender. Instead of exporting it at FBX, we can actually work straight from the .blend files. I'm going to switch back into Blender, I'm going to save this file into my Unity projects assets folder as cube.blend. Now when we go back into Unity, that .blend file is a model that we can access, and if I want to update it, I can switch back into Blender, I can make a few minor changes, maybe extrude another face or two, and then when I save and go back into Unity, it'll automatically re-import for me. Now the reason why this might not be the best workflow is because we're ignoring the .fbx, and that's actually pretty important if you want to do some texture unwrapping, if you want to bring it into other softwares. Let's say you want to bring it into Substance Painter or Marmoset or 3D Coat. If you're going to use any of this other software, you should be using the .fbx format, and that's why it's the industry standard, is because that format is going to work with all the software for texturing and unwrapping and doing whatever you got to do. However, if you're like me, you're a simpleton, you just want to make it easy on yourself, you can totally just work with the whole .blend file workflow, make everything integrated, make it all seamless, and then you just don't have to worry about exporting and re-importing and any of this craziness. And that's about it. Hopefully this is a much easier tutorial for you guys to follow. If you have any questions or tutorial suggestions, leave them down in the comments below. As always, my name is Kyle, you just learned something cool today, and I'll see you next time.